literature review is the critical analysis and integration of prior scholarship. It can contain 200 sources and still fail. It can be long and full of citations, yet never explain what the field knows, where scholars disagree, or why another study is necessary. The problem is insufficient synthesis. Synthesis means integrating findings and arguments from several sources to produce higher level patterns, explanations, and implications. Today, we will examine how researchers move from collecting publications to a defensible argument. We will discuss searching, source quality, frameworks, which are organizing lenses for a study, synthesis, unresolved problems, and research design, the plan linking a question with evidence and analysis. A dissertation literature review is not an inventory. It should establish what is known, what remains contested, and what contribution a new study can make. Professor, before we begin, please introduce EIM and explain why this topic matters in its doctoral programs.
I teach as a dissertation advisor in the doctoral programs at EIM, the European Institute of Management, and I have advised more than 100 dissertations. EIM offers fully online MFHEA accredited doctoral programs at MQF and EQF Level 8 in Management, Healthcare Studies, Computer Science and Engineering, and Business Administration, as well as a dissertation completion pathway. The programs are designed for working professionals and combine structured research education with individual dissertation supervision. We guide candidates from the research problem through the literature review, methodology, analysis, defense, and academic publication. The aim is not only to complete a doctoral degree, but to produce rigorous, relevant, and defensible research. Further information is available at eim.education. The challenges discussed in this episode are central to how I teach and advise doctoral researchers at EIM. They also led Dejan, Cargnelutti, and me to write this article.
Let us begin with the basic definition. What is a dissertation literature review?
A dissertation literature review, this structured analysis of prior scholarship, is a chapter within a larger research project that positions the study, justifies its relevance, and establishes the unresolved problem and framework. The word critically does not mean being negative. It means examining the strength, relevance, limitations, and relationships of the evidence.
And synthesis, as you explained, means integrating several sources to identify higher-level patterns rather than summarizing them one by one.
Exactly. The review is both a process and a product. As a process, the researcher searches, compares, evaluates, and revises. As a product, the chapter explains what scholars know, where evidence is inconsistent, and why the new study is needed. We say that a research gap emerges from the literature.
Where should the review process begin?
With the scope. Scope means the boundaries of the review. It includes the phenomenon, context, source types, publication period, language, and disciplinary limits. Without a defined scope, researchers either collect an unmanageable volume of material or exclude important evidence without a clear reason.
Scope, then, tells the reader what the review covers and what it deliberately leaves outside.
Yes, most reviews prioritize peer-reviewed scholarship. Peer review is a process in which qualified scholars typically evaluate academic work before publication. Other sources may still be necessary, including books, dissertations, conference proceedings, working papers, preprints, or archival records. Fast-changing fields may emphasize recent studies. Historical research may require much older, authenticated sources.
So newer is not automatically better, and older is not automatically obsolete.
Correct. Researchers should retain seminal sources. A seminal source made a foundational or highly influential contribution to a concept or method. A practical starting point is to examine recent reviews of the focal phenomenon of the study, meaning the central subject being studied, and then trace their references backward to foundational work.
How does the researcher decide which sources enter the review?
Through inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion and exclusion criteria are predefined rules that determine which sources the researcher will include and which sources will be omitted. The criteria may address publication type, date range, language, full text availability, direct relevance, and the quality of the evidence.
Inclusion and exclusion criteria, meaning the rules for selecting sources, make the search more transparent.
Exactly. For example, the researcher may include recent peer-reviewed studies and exclude opinion pieces, unavailable full texts, or only indirectly related publications. Older work may remain eligible when it remains foundational. The important point is that the criteria should follow from the research problem. Convenience alone is not a scientific justification.
The article describes searching as iterative. What does that mean?
An iterative search develops through repeated cycles of searching, reviewing, and refinement. Researchers rarely know every useful keyword at the beginning. They start broadly, inspect the results, identify new terminology, revise the search strings, and search again.
An iterative search then improves through repeated adjustment, rather than one perfect search completed at the start.
Yes, the article describes 5 phases. First, initial scanning maps the topic and identifies starting articles, keywords, and relevant journals. Second, refinement adjusts the terms through synonyms, filters, and Boolean logic. Boolean operators connect concepts, while truncation retrieves related word form.
Boolean operators connect concepts, while truncation retrieves related word forms.
Correct. Third, execution applies the refined searches across suitable databases. Fourth, documentation records the databases, strings, limits, dates, and changes in a search log, which is the record of those decisions and results. Fifth, the researcher reaches a practical stopping point when repeated searching no longer changes the substantive understanding of the field. The article calls this search saturation. Search saturation means that additional searches no longer produce substantively new concepts, themes, or central sources relevant to the problem.
Search saturation, meaning a point of diminishing substantive returns, does not prove that every relevant publication has been found.
Exactly. It is a reason-stopping rule, not a guarantee of perfect completeness. The researcher should use appropriate databases, trace references and later citations, test alternative terms, and document the stopping decision.
What role can artificial intelligence play?
AI-supported discovery means using artificial intelligence tools to identify potentially relevant publications, related papers, or citation networks. A citation network maps how publications cite and connect with one another. These tools can accelerate orientation, but they do not replace close reading or critical synthesis.
AI-supported discovery can help locate material, but the original publication remains the evidence.
Precisely. Researchers should verify every reference and every substantive claim against the original source. AI output may contain invented references, incomplete coverage, or inaccurate summaries. The researcher remains responsible for the literature base.
Once the researcher has collected the sources, how should they assess them?
The first step is source appraisal. Source appraisal means evaluating whether a source is credible, relevant, sufficiently rigorous, and appropriate for the claim it will support. The article presents the CRAP test as one practical heuristic. A heuristic is a structured aid to judgment. It helps the researcher ask useful questions but does not replace expert evaluation. CRAP stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. Currency concerns timeliness. Relevance concerns value for the problem. Authority concerns the credibility of the author or publisher. Accuracy concerns reliability. Purpose asks why the source was produced and whether particular interests may influence it.
The CRAP test, then, is a first pass source evaluation aid. It is not a complete assessment of the methodology of a peer reviewed study.
Correct. For a study based on observed data, the researcher must also inspect how it was designed, whom or what it studied, how it measured the concepts, how it analyzed the evidence, and what limitations remain. After appraisal, the researcher needs tools for organization. An annotated bibliography is a working document that records a concise summary and critical reflection for each source. It captures what the source studied, found, contributed, and failed to resolve.
An annotated bibliography, meaning a critical record of each individual source, supports disciplined reading.
Yes, a literature review matrix is a comparative table that tracks characteristics across several sources. Typical columns include the design, framework, context, sample, the participants, cases or records studied, findings, relevance to the research questions, and methodological notes.
The matrix then supports comparison across studies rather than reflection on only one study.
Exactly. The annotated bibliography supports source-level understanding. The matrix supports cross-source synthesis. Reference management programs can assist with PDFs, citations, and reference lists, but researchers must verify all bibliographic details and final references manually.
Why does the literature review need a framework?
A framework provides the lens through which the researcher defines and studies the problem. A conceptual framework is an interpretive structure that organizes key concepts and their proposed relationships to guide the study. A construct is an abstract research concept, such as motivation, trust, engagement, or perceived usefulness. In qualitative research, which uses non-numerical evidence to understand meaning, experience, or process, the conceptual framework often develops from several ideas rather than one formal theory. It can guide interview questions, observation, coding, the systematic labeling and grouping of qualitative evidence, and interpretation.
A conceptual framework, meaning a study specific structure of concepts and relationships, helps define what the researcher will examine.
Correct. A theoretical foundation uses an established theory, an organized explanation of how or why phenomena relate, or a group of theories to guide the study. In quantitative research, which uses numerical evidence to measure or test patterns, it often provides a deductive basis for hypotheses, variables, measurement, and analysis. A hypothesis is a specific, testable prediction. A variable is a characteristic that can take different values. Deductive means moving from a general theory towards a specific prediction or test.
A theoretical foundation, meaning an established explanatory basis for the study, often connects theory with variables and hypotheses.
Yes, these are common patterns, not rigid rules. Qualitative studies can use established theory, and some dissertations use both forms. The key requirement is alignment. The framework should connect the problem, purpose, research questions, methods, and later interpretation.
This is where many literature reviews become weak. How does a researcher move from summary to synthesis?
By organizing the chapter around research strands rather than around individual authors. A research strand is a thematic subsection that examines one dimension of the research problem. Within each strand, the researcher compares findings, theories, methods, measures, and contexts. The central question is not, what did each author say? It is, what does the field collectively show about this issue?
A research strand, meaning a thematic line of analysis, brings related studies into one argument.
Exactly. The article recommends the meal pattern for analytic paragraphs. MEAL stands for main idea, evidence, analysis, and link. The main idea states the claim. The evidence integrates relevant findings from several sources. The analysis explains similarities, differences, contradictions, and possible reasons for variation. The link connects the paragraph to the strand, an unresolved issue, or the next point.
Could you demonstrate the pattern?
The main idea might be instructor presence often affects student engagement in online learning. The evidence would integrate studies reporting stronger engagement with regular interaction and feedback. The analysis might attribute differences to platform design, class size, or the type of interaction measured. The link would justify closer attention to how the new study defines and measures engagement.
MEAL, meaning main idea, evidence, analysis, and link, turns citations into an argumentative paragraph.
Yes, using more than one source in most analytic paragraphs is a useful heuristic or decision aid, not an absolute rule. A foundational theory may justify one source, but a broad claim normally requires several. Researchers should explain disagreement. Contradictory findings may result from different populations, contexts, definitions, measures, designs, or analytic choices. A review becomes stronger when it explains why evidence differs.
How does the researcher move from synthesis to a research gap?
A research gap is a clearly defined absence, limitation, or unresolved tension in prior scholarship that a new study can address. The article identifies three common forms. An empirical gap means that relevant evidence is missing or insufficient for a particular population, the wider group of interest, setting, relationship, or period. A theoretical gap means that existing concepts or explanations remain incomplete, inconsistent, or insufficiently connected. A methodological gap means that previous designs, samples, instruments, tools like questionnaires, tests, or interview protocols, data sources, or analytic procedures limit what researchers can conclude.
An empirical gap concerns missing evidence. A theoretical gap concerns incomplete explanation. A methodological gap concerns limitations in how prior studies produced knowledge.
Exactly. Each thematic strand can end with a microgap. A microgap is a smaller, unresolved issue within one strand that contributes to the final focal gap. The final gap should not appear suddenly. The reader should see how the strands converge on it. A gap must be researchable and significant. The researcher must explain why it matters.
How should the literature review lead into the methodology chapter?
The methodology is the overall rationale and strategy for conducting the study. The concluding section of the review should synthesize the strands into a coherent account of what is known, unknown, and contested before leading into the methodology chapter. The research questions or hypotheses should then emerge from the documented gap. The research design should respond directly to limitations in previous evidence. For example, if earlier studies used narrow samples, the new sampling strategy may address that weakness. If previous research used inconsistent measures, the new study should justify a clearer instrument. If most evidence was cross-sectional, a longitudinal design may examine development over time. A cross-sectional design studies a phenomenon at one point or during one limited period. A longitudinal design examines change across more than one point in time.
Cross-sectional means a time-specific view. Longitudinal means examining change across time.
Correct. If numerical studies identify a pattern without explaining it, qualitative evidence may examine the underlying process. The research should explain why the chosen design, sample, instrument, and analysis are warranted. This produces methodological coherence. Methodological coherence means that the research problem, gap, framework, questions, design, methods, analysis, and claims support one another logically.
Methodological coherence, meaning logical fit across the study, is the bridge from Chapter 2 to Chapter 3, where the methodology, the rationale for the research approach, is explained.
Yes, later the discussion chapter should compare the findings with the reviewed literature.
What distinguishes an excellent doctoral literature review?
It is comprehensive without becoming indiscriminate, integrative rather than descriptive, and critical rather than celebratory. Its search is transparent, its framework aligns with the problem, it explains what is known, unknown, and contested, produces a specific gap, and prepares the research design.
What are the most common failures?
First, serial summary, presenting one study after another without comparison. Second, one-source paragraphs used to support broad claims. Third, weak alignment between the literature strands, problem, purpose, and questions. Fifth, concept drift, which means using central terms inconsistently across the chapter. Sixth, reporting findings without examining the theories and methods that produced them. Seventh, selective coverage of convenient sources while ignoring central debates or contradictory evidence.
What is the practical sequence a doctoral researcher should follow?
Define the phenomenon, context, and preliminary problem. Map the field through recent reviews and foundational sources. Establish selection criteria. Keep a search log, the record of search decisions, and refine the terminology until further searching no longer changes the substantive picture. Appraise each source in an annotated bibliography. Compare sources in matrices, justify the framework, organize the chapter into strands, use main idea, evidence, analysis, and link, end each strand with a microgap, the smaller unresolved issue within that strand, and show how the strands converge on the focal gap, questions, and design.
The tools support judgment, but they do not replace it.
Exactly. A matrix cannot decide what matters. A checklist cannot explain contradictory findings. Reference software cannot verify the intellectual accuracy of a citation. AI cannot replace close reading. The researcher remains responsible for the argument.
Let us conclude with the larger purpose. What should a strong literature review ultimately achieve?
It should achieve three outcomes. First, it should establish a specific and researchable gap. Second, it should justify the conceptual or theoretical lens that structures the study. Third, it should create the basis for interpreting the eventual findings as confirming, extending, refining, or challenging prior scholarship. A contribution becomes meaningful only when readers can see how it relates to the best available knowledge.
So, the literature review is not where researchers prove that they have read enough. It is where they demonstrate that they understand the field well enough to contribute to it.
Exactly. A rigorous review moves from sources to synthesis, from synthesis to design, and from design to a defensible scholarly contribution.
This conversation was based on the article Literature Review Fundamentals for Researchers by Michael Neubert and Dejan Cargnelutti. The complete reference and DOI appear in the episode description. Thank you for listening to EIM Research Conversations.